everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale, and we're coming at you for episode 3 of season 3. Rod, today we want to talk about Cardinal Screwtape, or rather, Cardinal McElroy out of San Diego just published a banger in American Magazine. It's a Jesuit publication in North America. So he did something pretty amazing, pretty fantastic. We're going to hit that. We're going to hit your appearance on the Dishcast with Andrew Sullivan. And then we will finish up with a situation that is really quite remarkable and really quite disturbing coming out of our hometown, Baton Rouge, with a young woman who was killed, died, raped, awful things out in Tigerland. So anyway, we're going to hit all those things. But before we get into these sort of heavier, weightier, typical General Eclectic podcast topics, you, my friend, were out and about on town running into some of our rabid fans, were you not?
A rabid fan. I'm just coming back from having beers with some Spanish Catholics who happen to be in Budapest now for a conference. And one of them was a guy named Jorge Soli. Jorge lives in Barcelona. He's a publisher. I'd met him a few years ago, just a wonderful guy. And I told him I needed to finish up and go home to record the General Eclectic podcast. He said, "Oh, I listened to your podcast, you and Kale." When I'm cooking dinner for my wife, and I was able to, by the miracle of smartphones, I was able to introduce you and Jorge. So a big shout out to Jorge. It's such a delight to know that we have listeners all around the world, faithful guys who are just decent people who want to know what's going on. And
it's great for me. You know, I you're a little bit more out and about the town, the world. You know, I'm sort of toiling here in my little monastery, actually a monastery, here in Rhode Island. And so I don't get to rub shoulders with, our scores of fans. So anyway, it's cool to see him. You should know, audience, that Rod FaceTimed me and I was able to say hello to Jorge in person. I think I shocked him a little bit though, Rod, since he tends to listen to the podcast. I think seeing me in all my glory was perhaps a little bit, was maybe a bridge too far.
No, but anybody told me, he said it was so great to see Kale, whose voice I know. And all kidding aside, it is such a delight to know that we're able to reach people and build a community, not only in the U.S., but around the world. And so thank you, Jorge, and thank you, everybody who listens. Indeed. We're all, whether we ever meet each other or not, we're all part of a community. So God bless you all.
Indeed. All right. Well, look, let's tack from something relatively pleasant and awesome to something that's is pretty disturbing. I right before I went to bed last night, Rod, I tend to be an early to bed guy, but it was around 8-9 o'clock last night. I was doing what I usually do, is just sort of doing a quick scan of Twitter before I go to bed, which is sort of maybe not a good habit. But at any rate, yeah, I know, it's a bad habit. But at any rate, I was doing this and I saw that Cardinal McElroy, a West Coast cardinal and bishop, published a piece in America Magazine. And so I did a quick scan. I was sort of intrigued enough because I saw the headline, and I was intrigued enough to read the article, and I started reading it. And of course, like, I'm pretty struck. And I'm struck by, Rod, is it's brazen and astounding that a cardinal of my church would say the things that he was saying. But I was also struck, Rod, and maybe you can get into the meat of what was going on, but I was struck by the style and the idiom of the piece as well. So why don't you just get into it real quick? You know, what did you see? So I know I sent you something either last night or early this morning. I'm like, dude, you got to check this out. This is nuts.
No, it is nuts. America's a Jesuit magazine. And, let me start by saying, Kale, that, I'm not a Catholic, you are, but this is a story that everyone should pay attention to because, if you're a listener of this podcast, chances are you're a religious conservative, probably a Christian. And what's happening now in the Catholic Church is going to affect all of us. The woke are storming the bastion. Cardinal McElroy was made Bishop of San Diego, was made a cardinal by Francis in 2022, and he was known as being a big liberal in the American church. In fact, some of our listeners may have first heard of him because Richard Sipe, the late Richard Sipe, church liberal, but was just an absolute bear about clerical sexual abuse. He was a sociologist by trade, and he met with Cardinal McElroy and wrote him a formal letter in 2016 warning him about Cardinal McCarrick, Theodore McCarrick, who the world would find out in 2018 was actually a serial sexual abuser. And he's been, defrocked. Right. But McElroy didn't do anything about it because I think because he was, an ally, a theological ally of McCarrick.
To McCarrick? To Uncle
McCarrick.
Ted?
Yeah, to Uncle Ted.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this new essay in America, it's about the synodal process going on in the Catholic Church now, which seems to be a sort of ongoing new council of the Church. I'm not quite sure exactly what's theologically where it stands, but it's something Pope Francis has called to consider where the Church stands on this or that issue. Anyway, McElroy has this essay out, which is just breathtaking, and I encourage listeners to go read it for yourself because it'll blow your mind that a Catholic cardinal is saying these things.
Just a heads up, Rod, the link to the article is below in the show notes, as well as the link to your post that you put out sometime after you read it. It's just right below right now.
So McElroy is saying this is what the Synod needs to do. And he starts out using, Kale, the language that we're all used to now whenever this deceptive stuff comes up from the left about inclusivity and structures of exclusion and all that. And, we're going on a journey together, blah, blah, blah. Dialogue. It's the language that the church left always uses when they want to overturn church teaching. And they're using this to frame opposition to what they want to do, which is to say, to frame Orthodox Christianity in a hostile way, in a way that if you believe what the church has always taught, then you, in some sense, are a bigot, you're trying to exclude people, et cetera, et cetera. He goes on to talk about how using this flowery therapeutic language, which is heavily ideological. I think you said in one, perhaps it was on a tweet you sent, Kale, saying that this is the language of critical theory brought to the Catholic Church. Yeah. And he just kind of goes on and on about we've excluded so many people from the peripheries, blah, blah, blah. And then he gets to the bombshell, the real bombshell, which is he thinks that the Catholic Church needs to cast aside its teaching that homosexuality is sinful and embrace homosexuals because homosexuals who are unrepentant. Because this is what Jesus would do, because the church is a hospital for healing, et cetera, et cetera. It is a radical thing, but I don't think that a lot of people are going to see it as radical, if they even hear about it at all, because of the way the guy frames it. It's using the sort of language, the therapeutic language we've all gotten used to.
Yeah, so what strikes me, and I'm gonna read a chunk that you quoted in the piece, but I think what people have to understand, and look, maybe people will get upset with us and get tired of us talking about things that are woke and all that, and honestly, at this stage of the game, I am not interested in doing the kind of throat clearing that I may have been inclined to do a year or 2 years ago about this. The ideology that is marching through all of our institutions. And as Rod has pointed out, Rod, as you're talking about this, is not just a Catholic thing. It is in nearly every institution that I can come up with off the top of my head. And, it all marches under the basic and fairly broad seeming banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what our audience has to understand is that those words don't mean what you and I think they mean, right? diversity, like, oh, okay, multiple points of view, inclusion, oh, like be inclusive and include people that, and then equity, oh, we should be equal and have everybody part of the gang, everybody be part of the gang. And
who can object? Who can
who could object to to these, common sense measures and good natured citizens? Well, look, if you actually read in deeply into this work, right, this sort of critical theory apparatus, you understand very quickly that they actually don't mean diversity. It doesn't mean inclusion, and it doesn't mean equity, not in any kind of common sense usage of those terms. Look, it's the same way that when Drag Queen Story Hour talks about family-friendly Drag Queen Story Hour, I mean, for people like you and me, we're like, family-friendly, like, this is ridiculous, right? But in their specific idiom, family is a word that they are sort of using and reworking and reframing. So it's not family like mom, dad, Bill, Sally, Lucy, and Jenny. It's your new fam, right? It's your fam that gets you. I see you. I get you, right? It's a basically a stretching and a twisting of the notion of family to include that which it isn't, right? And so with diversity, equity, inclusion, all of these terms are basically, they actually mean the opposite of any sort of common sense way that we would use these words. So when Cardinal McElroy uses the word inclusion, it immediately set off my radar, right? And, because it's not what he means. And this is sort of one of the things you quote in the piece. This is now, I'm quoting the Cardinal. It is important at this stage in the synodal process for the Catholic community in the United States to deepen our dialogue about these structures and cultures of exclusion for two reasons. The first is to continue to contribute to the universal discernment on these issues, recognizing that these same questions have surfaced in many nations of the world. The second reason is the recognition that since the call to synodality is a call to continuing conversion, notice the game, the word game there, reforming our own structures of exclusion will require a long pilgrimage of sustained prayer, reflection, dialogue, and action, all of which should begin now. Okay, then just quickly, and then I'll let you jump in on these things. Such a pilgrimage, notice the link, such a pilgrimage must be infused with an overpowering dedication to listen attentively to the Holy Spirit and a process of discernment, not political action. It must reflect the reality that we are part of a universal and hierarchical church that is bound together on a journey of faith and communion. Now, the sort of the sliminess of this, I mean, how does this?
Oh my God!
Help me out.
It is total propaganda. That's all it is. It is propaganda designed to paralyze any critical faculty by making people who are like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right, make them think there's something wrong with them. Because again, he uses the language of therapy. We're on a journey together, dialogue, blah, blah, blah. People who, from the Protestant churches that have liberalized, people who are trying to fight for the Orthodox, small o Orthodox faith, they know what's happening here. They've heard that dialogue was just, it wasn't really meant as let's have an open conversation. It was a strategy, or rather a tactic, to disarm people until the left gets control over the institution, at which point dialogue stops because the Holy Spirit has spoken. Kale,
well, dialogue seems to always magically produce an intended and decidedly progressive outcome almost every time. Boy, it's like it bats 1,000, Rod.
Yeah, it's amazing that way. And what puts this in a certain relief, Kale, is over the past couple of days, I've gotten emails from Methodists in the United States who every Methodist individual congregation is undergoing a discernment process right now about whether or not to stay with the United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church is splitting over LGBT issues. And there are some who are going with LGBTQ. It's important.
Yeah, whatever. The T and the Q are, well, not to be a nudge about this, but the T and the Q are really the end goal here.
Anyway, and so some churches, big churches, have individual congregations have been leaving the United Methodist Church. The people I've been hearing from come from parishes, or we call them parishes, but congregations who are in the process of discerning now, and the stuff they're telling me is just breathtaking. They say that within the processes in their own churches, the progressives who want to stick with the United Methodist Church are accusing them of hatred, of bigotry, of being backwards. And we have evolved now, they say. The society has evolved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing that jumps out at me about what I'm hearing from Methodists is that the sense that I'm sure a lot of Catholics feel, that, these are people, a lot of people who go to church, they just want to go to church. They're not interested in theological back and forth about sexuality or church politics, but they are being bamboozled by this. And when they are told by progressive activists within the church, that if you disagree with us, if you question this, that means that you are probably a backwards bigot. They're silenced, or they're ashamed of what they believe, that the fact that they believed of what the church has always taught, they're suddenly ashamed of it. And now here you have in the Catholic Church a cardinal, not just anybody, a cardinal appointed by Pope Francis, saying that people who believe that what the Catholic Church still today, for the time being, teaches as is official truth, saying that those people are backwards and wrong, and the church teaching has to change to make what has been considered sinful since the very beginning of the church, and what is so clearly sinful in Scripture, must change. Oh my God, this is apocalyptic. And I don't think I'm being too strong there.
No, I don't think you are. People are like, yes, Kale, of course. Yeah. How many cardinals do you think there are in the world, Rod?
I have no idea. Maybe 180?
Not even. So there are about 125 to 130 cardinals in the world right now. Okay. Sitting atop multiple millions of Catholics throughout the world, right? These are important men. They're consequential men. And one would think that in order to sort of become a cardinal, that it would require some nod in the general direction of a shared creedal reality.
Fidelity to the deposit of the faith.
Correct. We might even call that a kind of communion. And I'm fascinated that so much of McElroy's career, especially in the last 5 years or so, it's always about communion for the divorced and remarried, communion for those in irregular relationships. And he talks about communion as being some kind of, I don't know, sort of magic potion.
It's a magic pill that heals us. All right, this is an important point, and I beg the indulgence of our non-Catholic listeners who happen to be Christian to understand why this is important. McElroy talks in his essay, quoting Pope Francis, saying that communion is medicine for the sick, that the church is a field hospital, and I can agree with that. That the church,
right. I can get down with that. Exactly.
No, I actually can. But here's the thing: communion under Catholic teaching, and also in my church, the Orthodox Church, you're not supposed to receive communion unless you're properly disposed to receive it, meaning that you've been to confession, you are in a state of grace, which means simply that you have gone to confession and confessed your serious sins, and you are sincerely intending to repent. It's not to say you're perfect. It's just simply saying that, Lord, you've admitted to the Lord that I'm sorry that I've sinned. I want to do better. That's all that's required. But what McElroy is saying is, no, that's too much. Everybody needs to get communion, as if it were a sort of magic pill that heals us, absent our participation through repentance.
One is almost tempted, Rod, to suggest that the good cardinal doesn't believe that the Eucharist is real.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that we Eucharistic Christians believe that the bread and wine are transformed at the liturgy, right? And so that it is not just a kind of a cool thing that we do. It is not just a sort of a cool symbol, like, oh, cool, we're like eating the bread and wine like the Last Supper. We root ourselves in the hard teachings found in the Gospel of John, in which Jesus goes on at length talking about that unless you eat the body and blood of Christ, unless you eat my body and blood, you will not be with me in heaven. And of course, in that moment, I believe, if it's been a while since I've read it, a couple of years, but I believe that it is described in the Gospel of John that a third of his disciples leave the fold at that moment when he is teaching on the Eucharist, well, which certainly suggests to you and I as Eucharistic Christians that it's no joke.
No, in fact, St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians that if you receive the body and blood unworthily, if you're not taking it seriously, you do this to your own condemnation. You
profane yourself and you profane the Lord, right? I mean, this is a significant.
It's serious, and bringing it down to a practical level.
I
remember when I became an adult Christian, I became a Catholic. I took it seriously. I took the Eucharist seriously because I knew what the church taught. And I was in Washington, D.C., the Archdiocese of Washington, and like most American Catholic churches, nobody cared. You just come up, receive communion, nobody cares. Yep. But I cared because I knew what the church taught, and I knew that if I received the communion without repentance via confession, that it was a bad thing. It was sacrilege. And so what this effect had on me was it began to heal me of my brokenness, because I began to, I was trained over time by this practice to realize that my own healing depended on repentance.
Well, sorry just to jump in here, but yes, absolutely. Your healing depends upon repentance, but like even more sort of scaled out and more substantial for me on that individual level, but that like what I do matters, right? Like my action in the world matters.
Oh, that's it. You're right.
What I body forth into the world matters, and therefore, like what I do with my body actually matters.
Exactly.
And Rod, I think so much of what you and I feel so passionate about, but odd about our contemporary world, is that if you listen to the way that people talk about people, it's as if to suggest that the body doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And that's Cardinal McElroy. That's what he's saying. He's treating the Eucharist, the most precious gift that the church has, as if it were a right for people to receive. And when he talks about healing, that everyone has a right to this healing, what are we being healed from? He believes, according to this essay, he believes that there is no such thing as sexual sin. If you sin, if you violate the church's teachings on sexuality, no big deal. Go take the Eucharist. What does it mean to say that the Eucharist heals you when you don't believe you have a wound in the first place?
Right. And one of the things you and I were talking about, this is maybe a couple of weeks ago, but like so much of what, we have found as in our attempts to practice our faith, right, as sometimes difficult as it may be, is that there is a profound and perhaps paradoxical power in submission, right? That obey, like, fearing the Lord, sort of a proper fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that to obey the Lord is to know, love, and serve the Lord is our highest calling as human beings, and we're kind of entrusted with that. So I want to read just two more chunks from the piece, because I think that this is what really struck me about just how detached this essay is from what you and I would call the basic deposit of faith. I mean, like what you and I are talking about, these are sort of not denominational issues. These are foundational issues. He says this, it will be objected that the church cannot accept such a notion of radical inclusion because the exclusion of divorced and remarried and LGBT persons from the Eucharist flows from the moral tradition in the church that all sexual sins are grave matter. This means that all sexual actions outside of marriage are so gravely evil that they constitute objectively an action that can sever a believer's relationship with God. This objection should be faced head on. Stop, pause for a second. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Now he continues. The effect of the tradition that all sexual acts outside of marriage constitute objectively grave sin has been to focus the Christian moral life disproportionately upon sexual activity. The heart of Christian discipleship. Now, notice the turn, right? So he's basically saying or calling into question the notion that what I do with my body is not crucial or essential to practicing my faith and living out my faith, bodying forth my faith in this world. He goes on to say, the heart of Christian discipleship is a relationship with God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, rooted in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The church has a hierarchy of truths that flow from this fundamental kerygma. Sexual activity, while profound, does not lie at the heart of this hierarchy. Yet in pastoral practice, we have placed it at the very center of our structure of exclusion from the Eucharist. This should change. Rod, my friend, this is a bonkers statement coming from a cardinal.
It's Cardinal Screwtape. Cardinal Screwtape.
Dude, it really is. That what a slithery elision there, in invoking kerygma and all the big words.
It is the big words.
Sort of throw into an AI chat GPT type thing and spit this out. That is a profound, I'm not a theologian, but if that's not heresy, he is playing with some serious equivocal language right now.
Yeah. Well, look at our world today. So much of the brokenness and pain and violence in the world today comes from sexual sin. It just does. It is certainly true. He's right. This is what's so insidious about his essay. Mm-hmm. He's right that it's not the case that the only sins are sexual sins, but we live in a civilization now that has placed the sexual desire. That is our idol. That is the story. I had this podcast this past week with Andrew Sullivan. I love Andrew. I like Andrew. I not only love him, but I like him. But he is a guy who has made an idol out of sexual desire. And that is the thing he worships. He wants more than anything else. And so here you have Cardinal McElroy. And it's not just because he's gay. You have a lot of straight people who are the same way. They believe that
most. And I think that's. Can you just hang on that second?
Yeah.
Because I think it's important. I think that the high bar, right, of the Christian sexual ethic that has been part of this from the beginning, right, is not just high for straight people, right? It's for all of us, right?
Right.
And it's a real thing. It's not frivolous. And I hope that nobody walks away from this conversation thinking that you and I are, being frivolous about this. It's a high bar.
Let me go back to a second to my early years as a Catholic. I was a single man in Washington, D.C. as a Catholic. I didn't have many Catholic friends. I had to walk the path of repentance and chastity as a Catholic, and it was hard. It was not fun, But I didn't see why I was doing it. I did it solely out of obedience because I felt like I would be a fraud if I didn't do this. And I had lived before my conversion. I had lived a life of sexual freedom and had really screwed my life up because of it. I only found out years later that what God was doing in me through that life of chastity, through learning how to discipline my passion. A passion, it's not an evil passion, but it was evilly expressed in me outside of marriage. I learned that it prepared me. Learning to discipline that prepared me for marriage. And it was a good thing. But now you have Cardinal McElroy in an effort to be inclusive and all that, and to appeal to the zeitgeist, appeal to the spirit of our age. It's trying to leave not only gay people, but straight people who need to be truly healed and need the help of the church to be holy and to be made whole again in Christ. He's just tossing them under the bus, and it is so profoundly evil. And yet, people aren't going to see it as that because he uses so brilliantly and wickedly the language of therapy and inclusion, and love is love and da 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 da.
Yeah, so I wonder, Rod, I hear the therapeutic language that you're talking about. I also hear a kind of a little bit something slightly different and slightly sinister, which is the language of critical theory. How do you score this at home? I mean, you're like you're not a Roman Catholic. You're kind of from the outside. You're looking in and you're watching this thing unfold. And you and I have talked about this exact same pattern happening, in all the various denominations and in all the various institutions. It got married to woke capital and all those sorts of things. I'm struggling to understand what a Cardinal McElroy thinks he is accomplishing in this. And so, of course, I'm left with two options, right? My two options is that, he's a useful idiot, or he knows exactly what he's doing and he's looking for a complete transformation of the church into the not church.
Yeah, I think it's clearly the second is what's going on. He's not an idiot. And Francis was not an idiot.
He's a double PhD. He's a double PhD.
Right. And Francis knew what he was doing, making this guy a cardinal and not making Chaput, for example, the Orthodox Catholic, retired
or Cordelio.
Yeah. They're trying to radically change the church. This is a revolution. And why should it matter to people outside the Catholic Church? I'll tell you why. I remember when I was in the early 90s, when I was feeling a call to become a Christian, the Catholic Church was really the only thing there was for me for various reasons. But one of the reasons was I looked at Pope John Paul II, and I also looked at what was happening in Protestant churches. And I thought, the Catholic Church, they are the rock. They're not going to change. Yeah, in the local parish, there are problems. They're not faithful to what the church teaches. But in Rome, the doctrine will be held. This is a solid rock I can stand on. Well,
Rod, I actually believed that for a really long time.
Yeah, a lot of people do. And a lot of people need that. We all need this. Whether you're Catholic or not, you need Rome to be to stand firm. That's not happening anymore. If this guy, McElroy, and Pope Francis get away with the changes they want to make, then the Catholic Church will not be the Catholic Church. And all of us Christians, will be in a real hot mess.
Yeah, I agree. Look, Rod, Jesuits have been Jesuiting for a really long time, right? It's an internet meme of, Jesuit dirty tricks, and, it's an internet meme, and we're sort of actually, kind of oddly lulled into a sort of a strange sense of complacency about the Jesuits because they've been kind of doing this game for so long. Meanwhile, the Pope's a Jesuit, and all of the major offices are run by Jesuits and Jesuit-friendly prelates, like somebody like Cardinal McElroy. So, the Jesuits effectively run the church now, which is, again, if you would have, asked me 10 years ago, it's like, hey, Kale, can you imagine a scenario in which the Pope's a modernist Jesuit and all of the major dicasteries are now run, or sorry, all the major conferences now dicasteries are run by Jesuits and Jesuit-friendly priests? What would you say? I would have been like, ha ha ha, funny, put away your drink, you're drunk, go home. right? But here we are.
Yeah, and now you begin to see what Pope Benedict meant when he wrote that letter to Vladimir Palko in 2015, saying the powers of the Antichrist are getting stronger and stronger. I mean, it's crazy that we're even having this conversation, but look what's happening. I think that the fact that people can't, ordinary people who just want to go about their lives trying to be faithful, can't imagine what's happening is part of the reason it continues to happen.
Right. You know what it reminded me of? I think it was this morning, maybe it was yesterday morning, but you on one of your blog posts in the last day or two, you put a picture of the yard sign, right? The
in
yard
this
sign.
house we believe.
It's the in this house we believe thing, and science is real, and women's rights are human rights, and Black Lives Matter, and news isn't fake, and no human is illegal, and love is love, and kindness is everything. Okay, like we've all, if you've been online, you've seen this kind of thing, and you've seen it, and you've chuckled, perhaps appropriately, and not cried, perhaps inappropriately. But as you point out in that post, you could buy that at Walmart.com.
Walmart, yes.
Walmart.com. Okay, so just to, I know we're in this all the time, and so we kind of get worn down because we're so used to sort of the madness. But I think what is so striking to me is we are told over and over and over again, Kale, Rod, stop overreacting. There's, this is how about this for a line? You're going to love this one. We've had our temple to Apollo for 1,000 years. We've always had our temple to Apollo, and we're always going to have our temple to Apollo, says the Stooge in 365. AD. It's so reminiscent to me of that.
Of the
and
fall
you know what
of
it
Rome.
also reminds? Yeah, and you know what it also reminds me of? It's like, how many times did you get mocked by the winsome Christian crowd and all the various denominations in your book about the Benedict option, and then again in Live Not by Lies? Oh, Rod, come on.
It's not that bad.
Not that bad. Stop it. Why are you always being political, Rod? Why are you doing this? And yet the water is set to boil, and even like right now, like I can tell you right now, I could go on the Twitter right now, and I could start firing off some tweets about this Cardinal Screwtape situation, and I'm gonna get from a chunk of people that, Kale, come on, you just don't understand Francis's project. You're being political. You're being a trad, a bad trad, because you can't be a bad trad. You just don't understand, and it's not that bad, and you have to trust. And
it's
I'm
all
like,
cope.
what?
It's all cope. Do you remember, Kale, back in 2002, 2003, in the early days of the early months of the scandal, after the abuse scandal broke big out of Boston, there was this guy, he's still around, Mark Shea. He's a total nut now, but he was pretty sensible back then.
Well, he had a blog that I would read. He was one of the blogs that I read along with you, which was, I think it was Catholic and Loving It, something like that.
I mean, he was
a great blog back in the day.
Yeah, he was an
blog.
Orthodox Catholic. He had a sense of humor, but one of the things that I was considering myself to be an ally of his back then, but one of the things that drove me crazy about him was he kept insisting that John Paul II must have a secret plan to fix the scandal. We just got to trust. We got to trust the Pope. We got to trust the Pope. Even after it was clear that John Paul didn't have any secret plan, that John Paul was befuddled or whatever you think his problem was, he wasn't going to fix it. But Shea had deep down in his heart some chronic need to believe that the center was holding. Now, I mean, I haven't read him for many years, but apparently he absolutely hates me now. But I went and looked at one of his blogs, and he's a total Francis fanatic. He calls anybody who disagrees with Francis a fascist, a white supremacist. I mean, he has totally gone over the edge. Nevertheless, the same thing is there, this chronic need to believe the center's holding, everything's going to be fine.
And of course, what's interesting to me about that Yeats poem that you're invoking, The Second Coming, it's about the second coming. I mean, it's about, what is it? I love the opening lines here, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconing. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Can we just pause right? What a great stanza. Yeah. I mean, what a great stanza. But it is interesting because it's an apocalyptic poem, right? The unveiling of something and all of the sort of the contorted chaos that is occurring, like as something is about to be ripped open, the veil ripped, these kinds of things. How can we not think that this is where we are, that we're in the midst of an apocalypse?
Yeah, well, you cannot think it because it's too scary. I mean, you have for what my Methodist correspondents are saying, that people they're seeing in their own parishes are, just want to believe everything's fine. And if we just sit here quietly, everything's going to be okay. Let's not get too upset. Let's just trust in the process, but it ain't necessarily so.
I wanted to, the last little thing I wanted to talk with you today is something that you and I have been following, and it's a little bit of a different beat, but it's something that has captured our imaginations in part because we're from Baton Rouge. But there's a gruesome story coming out of Baton Rouge about a young woman and the sort of the crazy drinking culture. Tell us a little bit about this Maddie Brooks story and what you're sensing and what your take on it is.
Maddie Brooks is an LSU sorority girl, Louisiana State University sorority girl, who went drinking at a bar in Tigerland, which is a student district, a bar called Reggie's. And she got incredibly drunk. She had they did a blood alcohol test on her. She was like 4 times the legal limit. Incredibly drunk, caught a ride home with 3 young men. And according to the police, they raped her in the back seat of the car and then put her out in on a dark road south of campus somewhere. She was so drunk that she stumbled into traffic and was hit by an Uber and killed. I mean, can you imagine Kale receiving that phone call?
Unreal. No, that was
how your daughter died.
That was my first thought, man, was just, the horror of that, the circumstances, her last minutes and hour. I don't know how to process it, Rod, other than to say this, you and I both went to LSU and I know exactly the bar. I don't know that area. And the entire area, there's like 4 or 5 bars that are in this place called Tigerland.
Scuzzy.
It's really scuzzy stuff, but it's catered toward underage drinking. I mean, that's what it's for.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit strange because it's about 3 to 4 miles off campus.
Yeah.
Down this road called Burbank Road. And it's sort of a dark, like you said, it's kind of like a connector road.
Yeah.
And it's built up considerably since when you and I were young whippersnappers at LSU. But still, the whole thing is designed to facilitate and foster what I guess people would call binge drinking, just drinking a crap ton as fast and cheap as you can, to facilitate hookup culture. I mean, that's what it's for, Rod.
And Kale, the thing is, reading about what happened to Maddie Brooks, this was just an ordinary Saturday night for me when I was in LSU in the 80s. I didn't go to those particular bars because there was a social hierarchy there. Those were the bars that the fraternity people, the Greeks went to. My bars were, but we were doing the same thing in our bars.
Sure.
And it just shocked me because I have a son who just finished LSU and 2 other kids who are coming up. And I realized that what the life Maddie Brooks lived and the way she died, that could have happened to me or any of my friends.
Sure.
I have to believe that so many rapes happened, whether it was coming from bars in Tigerland or the bars where the cool people were.
Right.
It happened because this is how we lived. This is how I lived. You drink to the point of blacking out, and that was just normal. And this is part of the culture that we both grew up in. I don't know if it's like that in other places, but that's how we grew up. And I remember for me, Kale, I wrote about this on the blog, that I remember going to visit friends in the Netherlands, which is a famously liberal, permissive place. At some point, probably later in my college years. And I was sitting out on a terrace in front of a bar in this Dutch town with my friends. A bus pulls up. We're all drinking beer. A bus pulls up. And my friend said, "Oh, finish up. We got to get out of here." I'm like, "What do you mean?" They said, "That bus is full of Norwegians. And it's so expensive to drink in Norway that they come here and take bus tours because the beer is so much cheaper here. And they get blind drunk. And God knows what's going to happen. Let's get out of here." I learned that from observing the people there. I'm like, oh my God, these are students. They were my age, college students. And they had a completely different attitude towards alcohol. These weren't religious people. They weren't conservative in any way. They had just been raised in a culture where binge drinking was considered something you just don't do. And it was a shock to me because I began to realize that binge drinking is really an Anglo-Saxon, Northern European thing.
Yeah, well, whatever that is, that certainly is the culture that has been part of our world, the world that you and I grew up in, since well before we were born. I mean, that's just been part of what LSU's been about for however long. And, I can make my kind of jokes and I like going out and having a good time and all this sort of thing. But, really, as I sort of think about this as a 50-year-old man, and my kids are, 16 and 13 and 12 shortly. It's like, I can't imagine just sort of being okay with the thought of my kids going out and doing that. And I mean, look, I'm not naive. I know I did stupid stuff. You did stupid stuff, but there is a sort of an ambient surrounding culture that is a kind of a wink and a nod and a ha ha ha. And we move right along.
Oh, dude, I got wasted. And It was kind of shocking at the I'm a few years older than you, but it's now that you're a parent, it's the most cliched thing in the world. But it's like, what the hell were we doing?
But this goes, but Rod, my point here is even more than that, right? That there's a sort of surrounding adult culture that is clearly okay with it.
Yeah.
I mean, they sort of do this number and do this number and do this number.
What of our listeners?
Close your ears, close your eyes, close your mouth. And
hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil.
Right.
Because it's considered you're sowing your wild oats. And
right. And so, okay, so sowing your wild oats, right? Now, we can break down that image. You and I both know what that image actually is. It's rather disgusting, honestly. I don't want to be, sort of the resident prude here, but sowing your oats is code for like crazy sexual abandon.
All right, let me tell you what happened to me. When I went off to LSU as a college freshman, fall of '85, my father gave me a sack full of condoms with a nudge and a wink, and so like, be careful.
Wow.
And I wasn't even religious, but I was embarrassed by that. I'm like, you shouldn't be doing that. You're my dad.
Right.
But he would have never in a million years done that for my sister when she went off to college.
Yeah. Well, the double standard, that old sort of Southern double standard was a thing. But okay, this is sort of part to my point. I was looking into the story about the young woman who died. And, she's from like went to a private school in Covington.
Scholastica. She was a Catholic schoolgirl.
Catholic schoolgirl and all that sort of stuff. And you can make all your Catholic school jokes all you want, but you get my point, right? They were like an upper middle class, family, like a classic LSU Greek family, right?
Covington,
Greek as in
Louisiana, upper middle, haute bourgeoisie.
Right.
But this is how the Greeks behave there. Not just the Greeks. I don't want to just crack on them, but I remember when I was in LSU in the 80s, everybody drank to excess, or nearly everybody. That was the culture. But the Greeks, that is the fraternities and the sororities, they had a special culture of that. And that was part of the attraction of it. I remember, going to a few Rush parties. I never intended to become, they would never have accepted me anyway, but it just, the only thing attractive about any of that as an incoming freshman was that, man, you can get really wasted and they're girls.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, look, my brother was in Greek life at LSU. I was a nerd. But nerd is not really quite it. I was sort of like I was arrogant, and I was arrogant enough to know that the Greek thing was dumb.
You were a GDI.
I was, yeah, much to my brother's chagrin. But I was sort of defiant about it. Even though literally every one of my friends from high school, that I went to LSU with, every one of them rushed to their parties, and I went to a couple of parties, and they're all my friends and they're my guys. But I just couldn't wrap my head around it. Even then, like I just knew that this thing was weird and dumb. And again, it was later on that I understood this in sort of a properly moral framework. But I just thought it was unseemly. Like, and again, and I didn't mean it morally, Rod. You know what I mean? Like, when I'm an 18-year-old boy, I'm sort of like, come on, guys, you guys are a bunch of tools.
Okay, yeah, but this is a really interesting thing, because I think you and I were probably, even though we didn't know each other in college, you came after I did, we're on the same wavelength. It wasn't that I had any objection to binge drinking. I did it myself, but I did it in the Bayou Bar.
Yeah, right.
Chimes,
the Gator,
where the more of the hipsters were.
Yeah, right.
It was just so naked among the Greeks. It's like, here we are to be middle to upper middle class people, getting drunk, getting laid, and having a great time. And I mean, and again, I'm not trying to hold myself out and my people out as anything better than that. Our objection was aesthetic. It wasn't moral. It
was right. I think that's a good way to put it, because I just remember, and again, like there is a whole variety of Greeks. I mean, there are young men and young women who are in the Greek system who are good people, and they're not these, but there were the crazier ones, as you know, and there were the looser sororities and all that sort of stuff. And they all had their various reputations. But I just remember thinking, like, okay, so you're going to carry on for like 2.5 to 3.5 years of your college life like a complete animal. Like, honestly, like rutting and screwing and binge drinking and throwing up and carrying on like a freaking animal.
House.
It really was the idiom. It was the idiom. It was the model that they aspired to, was to be this, right? And then you're going to go to law school and become a lawyer, and you're gonna marry your Greek sweetheart, and then she's gonna go from that to being like in the junior league. And I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle the aesthetics of it.
But that's how it gets perpetuated, right? I'm not going to say anything about Maddie Brooks' family. Those poor people. I hope.
No, it's awful. It's awful.
Look,
it's hard not to be weird like me. It's hard to be, it's so much easier just like, look, this is your culture. Like, this is what you do. Your daughter goes to LSU. You rush a sorority. You have those cool pics. You go to football games. You do the whole thing. But the seedy underbelly of it is she's binge drinking. She's having lots of crazy sex. Yeah. She's smoking drugs. Who knows what the hell she's up to. And some people don't escape that. And sadly, tragically, Maddie didn't escape that.
Yeah. They found marijuana, THC.
Yeah, of course. Blood.
It's so sad.
It is. It's awful. It's really awful.
It's not only sad, but it makes me angry. And it makes me angry in a way that I know that implicates me and the culture I had at LSU, because if I had heard 50-year-olds Rod and Kale when I was in the 80s in LSU, I'd have been like, oh, shut up. Shut up. But you live a while. And you have kids, I have kids. You've raised these kids from little bitty babies, and you've watched them struggle. You watch them learn how to read. You watch them learn how to walk.
Amen. I know.
All of these things, and you've nurtured them, and you want the best for them. And to think that your beautiful blonde daughter goes off to LSU, pledges a sorority, but gets hooked up in this, binge drinking bullshit fraternity bar, and gets taken advantage of by these 3 creeps, may they rot in hell. And dies in a road, raped, hit by a car. There's something so that just, it's cries to heaven for vengeance somehow.
Yeah, no, it does, Rod. you and I always go back here, but, I go to Dante and, it's like, is there anything more disgusting than a peddler of flesh, right? The idea of a pimp, I always comment this to my kids when I teach the book, it's a sick culture when the word pimp becomes synonymous with cool, right? But when we think about the reality of what a pimp is, all right, what happens? I mean, what frustrates me about a culture that doesn't know what we're for, right? But we sure as hell know how to pimp out our children.
Yeah.
And the implication to me is that, you have a culture, and it's not just South Louisiana, it's in other places too. Perhaps it's a little bit more pronounced and ha ha ha, ironic and funny, Mardi Gras, yay type thing. But at the bottom, at the end of it is like, we have pimped our children out. And I don't know why. I don't know what that's for. Like, why are we doing this? And it reminds me of Louise Perry's book, right? Because, I'm sure a lot of, sort of like MAGA wearing, folks, who send their kids to LSU and vote conservative and all that kind of stuff, have no problem with the seedy underbelly, that is the reality of the world we're talking about. Right. And I know I'm all over the place here, but like with the whole Louise Perry thing, the tie-in is that
what's Louise Perry's book, the title?
So Louise Perry is the sexual revolution. Oh, I got it right here. It's
the case against the sexual revolution.
That's it. The case against the sexual revolution is that this is the downstream implications of a world that doesn't know what it's for. And so because, your dad gave you a big sack of condoms, and I'm sure, and we give our kids the pill and all these sort of things, and we just like, well, nothing really bad can happen. Well, guess what?
Well, and this is ultimately the result of what Cardinal McElroy is preaching. That
Amen.
In the end, sexual expression, the church is too hard ass about it. Now, to be fair, the culture I grew up in and you grew up in, the Catholic Church took a hard line on that. It didn't make a difference to us. But we still did what we did. You're going to have sin in the world no matter what, but at least we knew it was wrong. The culture that exists now, it's where sexual transgression has become the norm with the pornification of the public square. Yeah. And now you have the Catholic Church and Cardinal McElroy and others saying that, well, let's not be so judgmental about sex. We care about sex too much. Yeah, really? Do we?
Right. See, right. That's exactly my argument is that actually we don't care enough about it. We pretend that, it's just friction, like two bodies rubbing up against each other, NBD, no big deal. Whatevs, get over it, prude Kale, prude Rod. And it's like, no, I mean, it really, like what we do with our body. I mean, this is, again, a lesson that I root for me. It's rooted in Dante is that, what we do with our bodies matters. Like we are image bearing realities that matter. And, it's just so frustrating to me, Rod, to think that we set our children up for this kind of, the maw of the sexual revolution.
Yeah.
And we pretend that everything's going to be just fine because we've got condoms and pills.
Yeah. Well, you see, this is the thing too, that, my dad, God rest his soul, I mean, he was a good man in many ways, but he was also the product of this culture, this Southern culture. He wasn't a baby boomer. He was before the boomers. He wasn't part of the sexual revolution, but he just thought it was normal. He was a guy from the 50s that young bucks are going to go to LSU and sow their wild oats, and you will have fun with loose girls, but then you'll marry a virgin. That's actually, it sounds like a cartoon.
A cliche. But you're exactly right.
That's how they all thought. That's how they thought.
That's right.
And
but think about how dehumanizing that model is.
Yeah, for your sons.
Right, for your sons. And like those loose women, like those are people too.
Those are people's
So you're
daughters.
just going to sort of unleash your son to like, go mow down a few, young women, until you find one that, you'll not do that with. Like it's completely bonkers and nuts.
Yeah, it really is. And
unconscious, right? I think what strikes me about the whole thing, and I'm sorry for getting worked up about this, but it's something I'm pretty passionate about. It's like it's all so unconscious, and we just kind of have this film, this veneer over it, like, oh, everything's fine. It's sort of part of this cope thing that we were talking about earlier.
And the point I hope people take away from this is that as awful as what happened to Maddie Brooks is, this is not something that is of the 21st century. This was something that could have easily happened in the 1980s when I was in college, because stuff like that did happen.
Yeah.
Girls, guys would get just blind drunk, go home with, you didn't know who you were going home with. Yeah. You woke up the next morning, made the walk of shame back to your dorm. Yep. And this was just part of the college experience. You didn't know. If you knew it was wrong, and most people had in some sense an idea that it was wrong, hence the walk of shame, but it was such a peccadillo, such a minor sin. This is just part of life. It's part of life.
I got a question for you, and maybe this is right. You know, this is just what you do. This is sort of maybe the last question, and we should wrap it up here because we've ranted on too much, my friend.
I tell you what.
Why do you think, or maybe this is something we can chew on, and maybe people can leave comments in the video here. Why do you think that we've been able to avoid? Actually, I can't even say it out loud because I recognize the inadequacy of the question, but I'll say it. Why do you think that we have been able to collectively avoid looking at the costs that we have incurred with the unleashing of sort of these particular spirits, the spirits of the sexual revolution, and because this is an old thing now, Rod. You know, it's older than us, actually.
I think, Kale, because the general narrative that we all accept is a narrative of capital P, progress.
Right.
You know, that to be a free person is to be freed from religion, from traditional morality. You have to be free to be happy, and being happy is the thing that matters. If your sexual desire makes you happy, who's to say that's wrong? And I think this is a sort of thing. This is why so many more or less conservative people in the churches are surrendering to the ideology now that says that sex and your sexual identity and your sexual desire is at the core of who you are, not part of who you are, but who you are. Because this narrative has been it's propagandized to us everywhere all the time. And this is the thing when I got Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's fascinating to me, coming from the relatively conservative world that you and I grew up in and come out of, and in some weird, small little ways still sort of exists, certainly much more so than like the world that I live in up here in New England. When did the sexual revolution become an accepted bourgeois norm? Like, it really is rather remarkable as I think about this. And is this something that is entirely fueled by technologies?
Gosh, I don't know, man. I think that it's really difficult for you and I at our age to imagine what ubiquitous hardcore pornography has done to this younger generation. I mean, you teach them in the classroom. You'd know better than I. But there's just no sense.
Well, it's the pornography, it's the pop culture, it's the music, it's the it's not just pornography. I mean, it's pornography too, for sure, and that is certainly ubiquitous. But it's like it's more than that, right? It's like this sort of this. Again, I'm thinking of Louise's book, and this sort of the gals can be as raunchy as the lads type thing, right? And it's sort of like it's just weird. It's a weird like zombie feminism or something. It's bizarre.
I remember when, was it maybe 10 years ago now? Sometime when 50 Shades of Grey, that sadomasochistic chick lit thing became this monumental bestseller.
Over a decade ago, 12 years ago.
I remember reading stories about it, and I could not, with excerpts, I could not believe that this crap was being mainstreamed into moms. Moms were reading this.
Right.
It was the mainstreaming of extremely graphic and violent, transgressive sex. And I think in the end, parents, people of our generation, if you immerse yourself in this stuff and you somehow think it's not going to affect your kids, boy, you're wrong, because you yourself become numb to it. And when your kids are exposed to it, you have numbed the natural protective instinct that you should have as a parent. And I can remember there was a kid I grew up with who was raised by very permissive parents. And I remember the story about his parents where, well, they were sexually active before they were married, and they were kind of wild, and they felt guilty and didn't want to discipline their kids. Well, that's totally human. I understand that. But at the same time, they did their kids no favors. And I think maybe those who came through the sexual revolution and were revolutionized in their own behavior by it, a lot of them maybe felt too much shame to be too hard on their own kids. Or maybe they thought that, well, this is just how life is, you know?
Right. Or, you realize Sex and the City is 25 years ago?
Wow, really?
So Sex and the City is 25 years old, 1998. And you have an entire generation of young women who are now my age. I'm 50. They were formed by that, Rod, in a very real way. Now, I know that not everybody saw Sex and the City, right? But it was a phenomenon, as we know. And the whole premise of the show is that women can be as disgusting and promiscuous and predatorial as men. And I wonder if, again, these are the, we made all these, we took all these things and we've been taking them for 25, 35, 45, 55 years. And we have sort of skipped out on costs for a really long time. And I'm just struck, with all the swirling stuff that we see going on around us. And this is the kind of stuff that you and I have been talking about on today's episode, but really in a lot of the stuff we've been talking about in the show. And it's like, man, it really feels like, and sounds mean, but it really feels like that, the chickens are coming home to roost. Like it really does, man.
It's nemesis. Hubris has brought nemesis. And, I was thinking about, my daughter is 16 and I guess she'll be going to college in a couple of years. And I'm going to have that conversation with her.
Sure.
Like, do not do what Maddie Brooks did. Do not go to the bar and get liquored up and all that. And I can imagine what some feminists would say, like, oh, you're blaming the victim here for the rape. It's like, no, the people who raped that girl are the criminals here. Nevertheless, I don't care about the ultimate justice in the courtroom. I want my daughter, to get home unraped, whole, and safe. Right. And if that means she has to recognize human nature and recognize that you cannot control human nature by laws and by, sending males to
consent training,
bullshit. Sorry.
Yeah.
But
it's not real, right?
No,
right.
It's
It's refusing to look reality in the face.
Yeah.
And as our friend of the show, Alex Cushetta, often says, it's it just keeps seeming like reality has a right-wing basis or right-wing bias. It just keeps happening, that conservative, reality has a sort of a conservative bias. And I think it's true. And, man, it's a real wake-up call because we both, my daughter's just a year younger than yours. And, I've got, my kids beyond that. But no, it's real. And we got to face it. Hopefully, it's a tragedy, but you have to learn from it, and it'll be interesting to see what the conversation's like, back home and even in our environment, in the wake of this awful.
Well, I'll probably go write something about this, Kale, that, I'm happy. Lord knows I love nothing more than, shaking my biblical prophet finger, long bony finger at the contemporary culture. But the fact that you and I both agree that what happened to Maddie Brooks could have happened when we were in college, that tells us the problem is a lot deeper than that.
Yeah.
And and it happened in Louisiana. I can remember, Kale, I know we're running out of time. I'll wrap this up very quickly, but when I saw Mad Men, the show Mad Men, I was holy cow, that with all the smoking and the drinking, that was my parents' generation. Yeah. They weren't rich. Yeah. These are working class people, but good Lord, the alcohol. And it was normal. My dad, like everybody else's dad, he taught me and my little sister, when we were like 5, 6 years old, how to make his toddy for him. It was just,
that's right.
And he was no different than anybody else. Mad Men came from somewhere. And thank God that doesn't exist anymore, but there's somehow this deep sense of hedonism, that this is somehow an acceptable part of life. And if you don't agree with it, you must be some sort of weirdo church person.
Well, my instinct here, and I haven't fleshed this out, but I'll try it out with you, and maybe we can close on this. My instinct, though, is that binge drinking, as it has evolved in the past 3 generations, I believe that it is connected to the meaning crisis. I believe that it is connected to the fact that we do not know what we are for. And so we're left then to sort of piece together some kind of experience, right? Hooked up to what we were talking about last week, that, that the only thing we're left with is, experiences. And that's just such thin gruel, my friend. It's just not enough.
I wish I could philosophize. I'll tell you what I was for 1985 to 1989 when I was in college. I was for drowning any the morbid self-consciousness and any moral scruple I had, using alcohol to drown it so I could get laid.
That's exactly right. No, and again, I'm not saying that I was beyond or above any of that. I'm fully acknowledging that, but that is born out of an inability to, an improperly formed impulse into, the sort of the transition from childhood to adulthood. Yeah, and we've sort of murkied up this whole swath of, and it's deadly. It's deadly.
It is. And I'm realizing as we're talking about this, that nobody ever talked to me about sex, sexuality in any Christian way or any way at all. My dad's idea took me aside when he heard that me and my little friends in 5th grade, I guess, talking about Playboy magazine.
Yeah, right.
Took me aside and said, well, if you have any questions, I'm here for you. And I didn't have any questions. I was learning from Playboy and the playground what sex was. And I realized we had 0 sexual formation because our parents' generation was afraid to talk about it. And the answer, I don't think, is let school talk about it. Anything that you could have learned about sex from sex ed at school, we already knew. It ain't that hard. Right. But what we didn't know was how to deal with it morally, how to think about it morally, how to think about our bodies, not only in relation to God and the faith, but just in terms of a healthy sense of morality. Nobody talked about that. We just didn't.
No, I think that's right. And there's a tremendous body of work, right? That would aid in assisting our understanding of this, but we just don't seem to be interested in it because it runs against the idol of the age, which is, the more freedom all the time. Just keep hitting the freedom button.
Yeah, and now we
liberal
have this,
hard, liberal often.
Yeah, and now we have Cardinal Screwtape, who would certainly never in a million years endorse what happened to Maddie Brooks, but the ideology that he's backing into ultimately does.
Yeah,
it does.
Because what has always struck me in this, because what has always struck me about your conversion story is that, as much as you fought against the notion of having to sort of become a chaste, right, as sort of part of your faith commitments, like there was, in some sense, there's a kind of relief that something meant something.
Yeah.
Something was so profound that I had to even sort of put the proverbial cork in this.
Exactly.
Right? That I needed to pump the brakes.
Thank you
and
for
now,
saying that.
But I'm serious. But like Cardinal McElroy is sort of saying like, Rod, it's irregular. But I mean, come on, we're obsessing about sex. And of course you're sitting there thinking like, actually I'm kind of obsessed with sex, good Cardinal. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But that's part of the good news, right? Is that there is freedom in that is counterintuitive, but way more sustaining.
Exactly. And when I was recording Andrew Sullivan's podcast last night, I just totally blanked on all this because I realized that for me, I don't think there's any argument to be had anymore. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but for so long, I've realized that there's no good faith argument to be had about the goodness of Christian teaching on sex. I think it's all about obedience. Folks like Andrew, for all their virtues, they don't want to hear it. There's no argument that's going to convince them because it's not about the mind, it's about the heart. And so when I'm asked by Andrew this question that seemed like it was 10 years old about how can you say, you know, I wish I had something to say here, but it's just like, you're not willing to obey. This is what the Bible says. This is what the church teaches. And he just wasn't willing to hear that. But if I'd come up with the best possible argument, propositional argument, it wouldn't have mattered because his heart is not willing to follow.
Right. And then this is where you learned, you know, through the forge, so to speak, that, you know, the formation of fasting, you know, the formation that, you know, what this does to the person is that you're capable of things that you didn't think you were capable of doing before. Right. And what is better news than that, Rod? I mean, that you're actually capable of conquering yourself. Like, that's huge.
You know, I read somewhere, Kale, that if you read Dante, the greater sins are sins of the intellect under Dante. The minor sins are the sins of the appetite. But in the Eastern Orthodox conception, it's just the other way around. Their idea, and I think from my own experience this is true, is that the sins of the appetite are greater because if you can't conquer those, it will distort the sins of the intellect.
Interesting.
And that might be something to talk about on another time.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. And I think there might be some sort of interplay between those two things. I always thought that
Are you there?
Dante's taxonomy. Yeah, I'm here. I always thought that Dante's taxonomy went both ways. But anyway, all right. Well, look, we have prattled on, my friend. This is a lengthy show.
We have.
Why don't you do our thing?
Well, don't get nothing on you, Kale. Please. I beg you. Don't go to Reggie's bar. Don't get nothing on you. And I'll see you next week.
All right, brother. Take care. All right, bye.